It's my great pleasure to introduce to you Leanne Hadley. I met Leanne, several years ago at the Joyful Noise Conference in South Carolina, and I was so impressed with, I went to one workshop and then I wasn't signed up. I was so impressed with your workshop, I wasn't signed up for her second, and I crashed the second one because I just fell in love with her, and I think you will too. All of Leanne's credentials. She is a reverend. She's an ordained elder in the United Methodist Church. She also has her doctorate, so she's Reverend Dr. Leanne, so we can call her that.
Yeah, right. Everyone uses my title, please do.
She started a children's spirituality healing center in Colorado Springs, and has dealt with children who experience loss from everything from cancer to divorce to illness to whatever children experience, so much grieving and loss in our world. And she has a heart for these children ever since she was a little girl. I remember her saying that she went around with her dad, who was a minister, and visited with people from the time that she was T9C. So I think God has given her a special heart for those who are grieving, and especially children who are grieving. She did her doctoral, what do you call it?
Project.
On what she calls the spiritual formation, the spiritual formation you. And she's going to share some of that with us. And that is just such an exciting way for us to think about everything we do with children and how to have spiritual transformation take place. She's the author of several books. The one that I love the best is Touching Heaven, Real Stories of Children, Life, and Eternity. That was a bestseller and sold, 23,000 copies, and allowed her to take a nice long sabbatical this year. So she's been cooking up new projects, and hopefully we'll even be hearing about some of that. So she's a delightful, delightful person, and I'm just so grateful that she came to share her morning with us today, and I know you all are going to be blessed. Thank you, Leanne.
Oh, what a nice introduction. I'm so glad that you're here. Let's take just a moment and pray, and then we'll get started. Let us pray. Lord God, we have gathered in this space as those who see the needs of your children. We remember how Christ gathered children around him, laid his hands on them and blessed them. How Christ took a child and placed that child in the midst of them and said, unless you become like this child, you will never enter the kingdom. Lord God, we are the ones who have heard these words and live them every day. I pray that your blessing be upon all that are gathered here and upon our time together. Please give us your wisdom, your guidance, your love, your energy, and above all, the desire to leave this space and to go out and minister to your children as you would have us do. We pray all of this in the name of Jesus Christ, who loved children more than we do. Amen. All right, there you go. I want to start with just a little bit of history about myself, and then I want to talk about hurting kids in general, and then so it'll be a while till we get to the PowerPoint. So we're just going to do like old school talking first. I know that might throw some of you off, but we'll just try to stay in our space. So from my earliest time that I remember, my earliest memory is that I was 4 years old and I walked on a braided rug in my basement. My children, and I just walked like in a little circle all the time, and my parents actually got worried that maybe I had autism or something, and they had me looked at, and but the thing is, what nobody asked me was what I was doing on my rug. So I was playing music and walking in circles, but in my mind, I was holding the hands of children, and I was 4. So I believe that that was my call to ministry, and I never have wavered from that. I always believe that God put me on this earth to work with children. And so then I, grew up, and I always felt like God called me to work with children, and I went to work. I was a rainbow girl when I was 12. Well, first I did patterning. I don't know if they still do this with cerebral palsy children, but I would go to a center and we would move their muscles to make sure that they didn't get too frozen. And I did that when I was like in 6th and 7th and 8th grade. And then when I was in high school, I went to the burn hospital, and I spent time with burn children at a Shriners Hospital in Cincinnati. And so I've just always been, with children. I babysat, and remember that story where the guy was in the basement and it's really spooky and the girl answers the phone over and over and then he says, "I'm in the basement." Remember that spooky story? Well, I had heard that spooky story, so I was too scared to babysit by myself, so I would give my brothers my babysitting money if they would go with me, just so I could play with the kids, but I didn't make any money. And that was the beginning of me making no money working with children, so I guess God really planted that in me early too. So that was fun. And then I went to college, and I was going to do theater major, and I was going to do theater for children, and loved children's theater. But in the midst of that, it kind of felt called. Like I thought, I want to do religious theater, blah blah. Anyway, went to seminary, ended up a children's pastor. And 30 years ago, when I started as a children's pastor, it was unheard of. In fact, people felt sorry for me. The bishop said to me, like, "Honey, what will you do?" And I was young. I was like 22. I was like, I'm going to be a children's minister. I'm going to do for children what adult ministers do for adults. That's what I'm going to do. And they'd say, "Oh, honey, there isn't any such thing." And so I said, well, I guess I'll be the first. And then I met Leonard Sweet, came to my seminary. Do any of you know Lynn Sweet? He's he's a visionary guy. And man, he was super cute, let me just say, in the day. Anyway, he came to our seminary. We were all delighted. And I ended up being his babysitter for little Lynn. He was divorced at the time, and so I was little Lynn's babysitter, and I hung out with his mom a lot, who lived with him too. He took good care of his mother. And I shared with him what I wanted to do. And he said, well, what do we do to make this happen? And I said, well, I think I need a specialization in children. And he says, where do you get that? And I said, well, there isn't such thing. So he said, well, just do whatever you want. Do your curriculum, and then I'll sign off on it. If you're the first, let's do this thing. I said, okay. So I did my Master's of Divinity, and then I did another thing, but it was just my made-up curriculum of myself that I did, and then Lynn Sweet signed off on it. So I graduated with a Master's of Divinity and a specialization in children's ministries, but there was no such thing. So there still isn't. So I don't even know what my degree is. But then I got a doctorate in children's spirituality, so now I'm legit. So anyway, and during seminary, I worked at a hospital as a chaplain with dying children. And that's where my book, Touching Heaven, comes from, my bestseller. And I brought a copy of that, so some lucky person will get to go home with that book. And it's a tearjerker, so just be warned. And I also brought another book that we've written for First Steps, which is called The Golden Cord, and it's about sharing death with children in a very gentle way. And we'll read that later if we have time, so you'll see that book. And it's available through First Steps. They sell it. So then I work at a hospital. I love children. I'm going to be a chaplain for the rest of my life. The rest of my life, I'm going to be a chaplain. I loved it. And then it's a long story, but I got hired at my hospital, and then they made cuts at the same day. So I was like hired and fired in the same day at the hospital. And I ended up going into a local church and was a little bit disappointed because I didn't think there were hurting kids in the local church. And I went to Lebanon, Ohio. Have you ever been to Lebanon, Ohio? I love Lebanon. It's upper class, white, professional. The kids have everything in the world that they ever wanted. So it was like my worst nightmare. I thought, gosh, if I have to go into a local church, at least get me somewhere where there's there wasn't even a place in Lebanon where maybe like the middle class people lived. I didn't know anybody that wasn't, a high-ranking something or other. And I thought, oh, these kids aren't hurting. And then we had our first suicide, which was then followed by copycat suicides. And when we had lost 4 children in Lebanon, Ohio, I thought, oh, rich people have hurting kids too. How strange. And I never looked at children the same. So I continued, then I went on and I did my ministry. I was at Lebanon. I took my own church for a while because you have to do that to be an elder in the West Ohio Conference. I did that for my minimum requirement. And then I moved to Colorado Springs, mostly because my parents had died. I was a single mom with 2 kids, and I thought mountains were a healthy place to raise my boys, and it was. And so we went and climbed some mountains, and I healed and worked at First United Methodist Church. And I was there for 7 years. And then I got this calling to start a spirituality center. And again, everybody said, what is that? And I said, I don't know. I feel like this is what I need to do. And my vision was that it would be groups of children. So we would do what we did in churches, which is always groups of children. And then I would have a divorce group, and I would have a grief group, and I would have, an abuse group, and an children of alcoholics group. I'd have all these groups. And so we started it, and I thought I would run groups. And it was going to be in the church, but then the woman who replaced me, I'm glad this is being recorded, didn't like me very much, or, was nervous that I was still there, and so she pretty much told me to get out. And the first place I could find was my friend owned a bar, and he had some businesses some apartments upstairs of the bar, and I took one of those offices. And so I ended up over a bar in downtown Colorado Springs, which ended up being the best thing ever, because it wasn't great big First United Methodist Church, so people felt more comfortable coming into my bar, it wasn't a bar, but it was, my office over the bar, than they did coming into a great big church. So it ended up, everything works for the glory, right? Everything, if you just let God do it, it just all works out. So I was over the bar. And so then we started inviting children to come. And we had our groups all set up, and we'd get our donuts, and we'd get our, juice and everything, and we'd have like one kid show up. And I thought, wait, we had a group of 10 children. Why is there one? Now, some of them we lost because they played soccer, and their mother signed them up and didn't realize that our meetings would be at the same time as soccer, which, have any of you experienced that in your children's ministries? Kind of the given these days. But the other reason, I just started calling the kids, which is really weird, because I would call their house and I would say, hi, could I speak to Timmy? And the mother would say, well, he's 8. And I'd be like, I know, I need to talk to Timmy. This is Leanne, the woman from the grief group. And I would talk to Timmy, and I said, Timmy, why didn't you come to my group? Did something happen? And he said, and bless their little honest hearts, they said, well, I don't want to cry in front of my friends. It's too embarrassing. I might, And so one-on-one spiritual support was born. So then what we started doing was meeting one-on-one with kids. And I had a woman named Jenny who was the cookie baker, and she's still living. She's 87. And she baked over 6,000 cookies for me over the 14 years that I ran First Steps. Every month, my little cookies would show up, 4 different kinds. And the kids would come in, and we would have cookies together, and then I would spend time listening to them. And I had never done one-on-one spiritual support with children. I had done groups, and I had done, stages of grief and all that. So in that time with the children, at least the first 7 years, I pretty much listened to children. And I would say to them, does it help if I say this? How can you best tell me what hurts? And together in that space over that bar, I call them my tiny teachers, bless their hearts, they taught me how children heal. And they were so incredibly honest and so trusting of me. So it was the most sacred time of my life because there was just no facade. I didn't know what I was doing. They didn't know how to heal, and together we figured out this process. And then 7 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, I don't know, I'm bad with numbers. I forget when it was. Anyway, my seminary came to me and said, are you interested in doing a doctoral program on what you're doing with children? We think it's really fascinating. And I said, yeah, do you have a doctorate program? They said, no, we don't, but we have a professor that would like to work with you. So if you'll teach, he'll have the credential, and we'll get a group of people together to do children's ministry, to do a doctorate. And so there were 7 of us in the group, and we actually studied what I was doing with children over the bar in Colorado Springs. And in that process, I was able to come up with the model that I'll show you today. So everybody says, can I use this model? Is it copyrighted? Blah, blah, blah. Well, I mean, it's copyrighted in as so far as you copyright your doctoral dissertation. But I want you to use this model. And I don't claim ownership to the model. I named it. But I think what you'll discover is it's what you're doing intuitively with children. So I think it puts a name on what we're doing, and it gives us a focus for what we're doing with children. But the authors of this were children who were brave enough to walk through their grief with me and tell me what it felt like. Almost every day, I hear from one of these kids. They might just text me. They might call me. Last night I was telling Jamie it's hard to leave there because they, you say, well, I don't do First Steps anymore, but those kids don't care. They own me, right? So they don't, they'll call me. They're, and they don't know the time change difference. So, forever my phone rings at 11:30 and it's one of them, and I have no boundaries. But Anyway, but they're my teachers and I owe them, so I always chat with them because, they're my mentors. They just happen to be, this big, and bless their hearts. So that's the model that I'm going to be talking about today, and that's kind of how I got here. When I started First Steps, so it's called First Step Spirituality Center. It's still in existence, except now I think it's called this, I don't even know what it's called. It's in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. So, I should finish my story. So then I did that for 7 years, and then I went back to the local church for 7 years. My friend Cheryl, who I love to pieces, was the children's minister there for a long time, and she quit on Christmas Eve. Have any of you ever been tempted to quit on Christmas Eve because you're exhausted? Yeah, well, she did it. She put her little letter of resignation, and she called me and she said, "I've quit." And I said, "You quit on Christmas Eve? Are you kidding me? You need to rest." And then she's like, "No, I can't. I'm not starting." She said, "But you should come back to the church. They miss you, and I'll help you, and you need to come back." So I did come back, and her daughter, Ashley, just had a baby named Alexander, and we stayed very close. But anyway, I went back to the church for 7 years, and so then I was able to take this model that I had articulated and clunk it back into the church. And so it is expanded now into all areas of ministry. So I learned this model through hurting kids, but I believe that it is a model of spiritual transformation that we can use in Bible study, we can use in prayer practices, we can just use it everywhere. So again, and we'll talk about the model. I mean, it really is the model of Christ, right? Life, death, resurrection. We'll talk about that. And I think, so again, it's intuitive. It's what we do intuitively. So I did that for another 7 years. I was back at that church. If you want to be a saint, you should leave your church and then go back to it. It's a really amazing experience. So all those people that, I got on their nerves the first time, but then I left, when I came back, it was great. You really should do it. Leave and go back. Now I am a saint at that church, and I did everything the same. It's just that, I got older, and I don't know, maybe it was age. Anyway, I did that for 7 years, and then I wrote Touching Heaven, and, I'll be honest, I was tired. I was real tired. I've been a pioneer in this, for 30 years. So I was the first person to be a children's pastor paid. There were Christian educators, but they really weren't paid in the day. And so I just kind of paved the way for that. And I've been talking to people about children, children matter, children matter, children matter. And I really had gotten to the point where I felt like I was beating my head against a wall. And I said to God, I am dead dog tired. I got to take a break, and I'm going to leave the church. I'm done. I'm going to go be a public school teacher. Now, I didn't tell my church this when I left. I had written Touching Heaven, and it, as we've said, how many times can I mention this? Bestseller. I only sold 23,000 copies, but it's the most books I've ever sold. Before that, I only sold 1,400, so I'm really happy. But it gave me enough royalty to live on for a year, if I lived really simple. So my son, actually, who's a drummer in San Francisco, said, Mom, a lot of people that get burnt out and stuff at 50 and have a midlife crisis, they go back and get a degree. But since you already have a doctorate, maybe you should just take a year off. And I thought, that's a great idea. And then I went to Italy, and I had this experience with God, which I won't share with you because you'll think I'm a lunatic. But I went back to my church then, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to give up everything, and I'm just going to start fresh with ministry. But secretly, I was leaving the church. And so I told the children when I left, I said to them, who taught me how to be spiritual? And they said, we did. I said, who taught me how amazing children are? Well, we did. I said, then, well, I'm going to leave and go share with the greater world all about children's spirituality. I'm going to go be a consultant. And I just told them that because I didn't want them to know that I was leaving ministry. I thought that would be devastating. And I left. And all my stuff is in Colorado. I don't have any holy listening stones. I don't have my prayer beads. I don't have anything because I left it all. I took my robe because they stuck it in my car, and unbeknownst to me. And I was leaving ministry. I was just tired of nobody caring about kids. And so I went and I slept for a year and played with my grandkids. That's how I ended up in Lexington. I got 3 grandkids, 8, 6, and 4, perfect ages. And so we played together, went swimming, and I prayed, and I prayed, and I prayed, and I said to God, please show me the other thing you'd like me to do with this half of my life. And there was absolute silence. And eventually I realized that God was not going to show me until I stepped up to what God had asked me to do. And so in saying this, I might be delusional, but I'm pretty sure that God has called me now to speak to the greater church about children. And I'm answering that call. So you're kind of my coming out party. You're my first group that invited me, but I've already, I'm working with 4 conferences now, the Rocky Mountain, the Kentucky, North Texas, Central Texas, and what we're doing is we're getting groups of churches together, 20 congregations at a time, and we're going to try to deepen what we do with children. So we'll do a workshop like this and then mentoring for 3 years. We're going to do a 3-year process to really try to figure out what we're doing with children and firm up what we're doing with children. So I'm really excited about that. And then this new publishing company, Seedbed, has contacted me, and I think I'm going to design their children's curriculum for them. So I think that I'm on the right track, but a year from now you might hear that I'm over there teaching in a public school, but I don't think so. I think that this is what God's called me to do, and I'm trying to answer. And of course, as soon as I spoke up the first time and said, I'm a consultant for children's ministries, my phone started ringing. Amazing how God does that, right? So, so that's where I'm at. So that's what I'm doing. And I love being a granny. It brings all this balance to my life. And it's funny, as we do all of this, I've been calling it the Granny's Revolution. Because what's happened is we look to young parents to do all this transformative work with children. But the thing is, those of you who are young parents in the room, you know that you're exhausted. And the life of a young parent is so darn hard these days that they don't really have the space to join. They can join the revolution, but they're not going to be the main workers in the revolution because they're too busy raising their kids. And I was too busy raising my kids. We were all too busy. So actually, this is the Granny's Revolution. It's like those of us who are a little bit older, but we've still got all this energy and we're ready to do this next chapter in our lives. We're gonna help these young parents. And we're going to do it. And it's weird. The other day I heard this thing. You know how women outlive their husbands by like 20 years? Not everybody, but it's, if you look at the statistics, and somebody said, why would that happen? Like, what is the reason for that? An anthropologist has been studying this. You know what he came up with was that maybe women do that to help the young moms with their children. And all of a sudden I thought, whoa, okay. There's proof, scientific proof of the granny revolution. So that's what we're doing. I love being a granny. And they bring a lot of, joy. My friends are all like, gosh, it's so hard to talk to you now. There's always little people in the background because I babysit a lot. All right. So that's that. Anybody got any questions about that or anything? All right. So the mission of First Steps was to help hurting children at no cost. Everybody said to me, you have to charge. Nobody will appreciate it if you don't charge. I did not charge. Everyone appreciated it. I never had I had like maybe 2 appointments where somebody would cancel and they were the flakiest moms ever and I just knew they'd cancel and always do it. So we gave away our stuff and I probably met with 1,000 children in the course of 7 years that had all had a hurt of some kind. So what was shocking to me when I started First Steps was I thought that, and because it was at no cost, everybody thought that the children that came there would be the poor children who can't afford, a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or whatever. It was not poor children. It was children from every socioeconomic level. Children from what you would think of as stable families and children from the most unstable families. There wasn't really a pattern of the children. I saw children that were Christian. I saw children that were spiritual but not religious. I saw children that were Muslim. I saw children that were Jewish. I saw all kinds of ecumenical children. And I even saw people who said they didn't believe anything. I mean, they were atheist, but they had heard of us, and so they brought their kids. So I have a wide sample of kids that I've done this process with. And by the way, all the children believed in God. And I didn't tell them about God. I'm just saying that I think it is innate in them to believe in God. So I was like, well, how did you introduce God? And it was like, I didn't. I just made a space, and God showed up, and the kids knew it. So, all right, so I want to start with statistics about why, who our hurting kids are. And so this is maybe the most depressing handout you've ever been given at a thing. But I just want to whip through this, because when you start looking at the statistics, There are two reasons people aren't here today. One is because it's, bad weekend time, whatever. The other is people are saying, well, I don't work with hurting kids. Like our church doesn't have hurting kids. I don't have a neighborhood outreach program. I don't want to start one. I'm almost afraid if I go to something like this, I'm going to start a neighborhood outreach program. But what I want to prove today is that they are in our churches, they are around our churches, and they are in our families. And don't assume because the family looks, great, that child is not hurting. And we need to expand what is hurting from the worst of the worst to understand that children have hurts. And I just want to do a little poll before we look at statistics. How many of you had a hurt before you were 20 years old? A deep hurt. Oh, okay. How about 12? Sixth grade or under? How many of you lost a pet before you were 6? Broke your heart? Yeah? See? Hurts start really early. And I think that we've thought for a long time that children aren't capable of healing because they can't tell us about it or something. So we act like before 12 they're just immune. I remember when I first started First Steps, these kids said, my pastor's stupid. And I said, why? Well, my dad died, and my pastor came in, and he hugged my mom, and he hugged my aunt, and then he came to me, and I had on a Broncos hat, Broncos, we won last night, by the way, in case anybody cares, and he had a hat on, and he said, and then he says, whoa, what about those Broncos? What about it? Yeah, who you like? You like, John Elway? Who you like on the Broncos? And he said, why do you ask me about the Broncos? Wasn't that stupid? My dad died. Now, that pastor wasn't stupid, and that pastor didn't not care about that child. That pastor did not know what to say to that child. So my goal today is that you'll leave here ready to talk to a child who's grieving and feel perfectly comfortable doing it. But the church needs to understand that we need to be ready. And when you look at these statistics, you're going to see there's not a church on this planet that doesn't have children that are hurting already. You don't have to start a ministry for hurting children. They're there. If you have 4 children, I guarantee they're hurting. It got to the point with First Steps where I really believed that I could grab any kid off the street and they were hurting. And I used to go to, remember when Columbine happened? Well, of course you do, Columbine, the first school shooting. After Columbine, I didn't know what my response would be, and I lived in Colorado, and I went up, did some work at Columbine. But then I decided to start hanging out at Carl's Jr., which was where the kind of scary goth kids hung out. And that dressed like the Columbine people. And I started going to Carl's Jr., and I just sat there and I just talked to them. And it turned into this giant counseling thing every day. There'd be me and then all the goth kids from Colorado Springs, and they would come and they would tell me their stuff. And I looked at these scary kids that looked like army soldiers that were wanting to kill me. They were like the kids that typically I would cross the street, sort of. I didn't want to walk past. And you know what? They were just like the 8-year-olds that were coming to my center. There was no different. They just had to wear a uniform saying, I'm protecting myself. So there are hurting kids everywhere once we're aware of it. So we'll just look at some of these statistics. So these are national statistics, and some of them I put where I got them, and some of them I just found. But children living in poverty, 18% of all children. Food insecurity, that means they go to bed hungry. Not necessarily in poverty, but they haven't been filled to the brim. Unmarried moms, 40% of children have an unmarried mom. Difficulty with English, 20%. That might even be higher now. Illegal drug use, 8% of 8th graders. So that's 1 out of 10 are using illegal drugs. Youth that commit violent crimes, 11 out of 1,000. Children who are read to, only 55%. That's important when we think that we have to have some fancy storyteller thing. It's why godly play. How many of you do godly play? Any of you do it? Good. That's why I want you to do this session. I want you to show them. But godly play is great storytelling, right? So remember that as you're thinking of really amazing things to do with children, 50% of them are going to be amazed at a story. They've never heard one. They're not read to. So you just get a children's book and you read them a Bible and they go, where did you learn to do this? Only 55% of them ever get read to. And guess what? That's not just the low-income families. That's also the really, really busy working families that have a great income because there's 2 people working. Children who experience death before 8th grade, 25%, 1 in 4. And that can be that's the death of a close person. That doesn't count pets, and that doesn't count aunts and uncles. That's like granny, granddad, mom, dad, sibling. 1 in 4%. Depression in teens, 8%. Overweight children, 17%. So 1 in 5 has some weight issues that they're self-conscious about. And you think children aren't cruel to the kids that are overweight? They're cruel. Divorce, 1/3 of all marriages. It used to be 1/2. I think that's gone down. They say that the economic issues that we've had are keeping people married because they realize that divorce is economically bad. So again, God works in all things. You thank the bankers for that. 60% of all remarried marriages end in divorce. So most children that you're going to deal with divorce, or at least 60% of them, have had 2 divorces. They've had the original divorce with their parent, and then they've seen the other parent go through another divorce. So they're double divorced. Kids raised by single moms, 26%. Thus, you go up to the poverty and the food insecurity. Those match because single moms can't make enough money to feed their kids. Raised by a single dad, 5%. I thought that was kind of high. Raised by a relative other than parents, 3%. That's increasing. So grandparents raising children is a whole area that we're just starting to tap into in the church. And raised by a non-relative, 1%. Gay youth, 50% of all male suicides are from the gay, lesbian, bi, trans, I don't even know what the proper term is. I'm sorry, whatever that community is. I don't want to be offensive, but they have so many letters now, I can't keep up. 30% of gay and bisexual adolescent males attempt suicide at least once. And heterosexual youth that are harassed and called gay on the playground are 5 times more likely to attempt suicide even though they're not gay, just because they've been labeled gay. So that's a whole nother population of kids that, you're more effeminate kids, or maybe you're more masculine girls or whatever. They even just being teased about something that you're not causes them to suicide 5 times more likely. 160,000 youth skip school every day because they're harassed. That's a huge number, isn't it? 27% of gay youth have been physically hurt by another. 80% of the people get harassed. It's just, isn't this sad? 81% of the youth reported that faculty or staff either never or rarely intervened. Okay, move on to page 2. ADHD. A classroom with 30 students will have between 1 and 3 students that are diagnosed with ADHD. And then there's all kinds of trauma from that. You can read these later. I won't go through them. Let's get down to mental health issues. Over 4 million children in the United States are in some kind of therapy. And 1/3 of them have been diagnosed with 2 or more psychiatric disorders. That's a lot of children. Now take that number and realize that there is a shortage of psychiatric help for children worldwide, including in the United States. So in Colorado Springs, if a child was suicidal, you could take them to the emergency room, but you could not get them admitted to a place to help them for 6 weeks. That's the shortage of mental health that we have. Now, that's a suiciding teen. So then start working backward with all these statistics, right? If you have a kid that's bullied at school, they're not going to get a psychiatrist because we've got a waiting list for the suicidal ones. Back that up. If your child lost a dog or a pet or granny, they're not going to go to a psychiatrist because they're not bad enough yet. So imagine all of these children who are not getting psychiatric care. And 4 million children are. So the need for pastoral care, intervention of some kind is just, do you see the numbers of that? Like if we put that many beads in a jar, would it fill this whole area? I don't even know. That's a lot of children needing help. 1 million have a parent deployed 1 or more times. Do y'all have a lot of military around here? Got military kids? Anybody? Well, in Colorado Springs we do, and the fathers were deployed 8 times. So a 10-year-old had their father gone for 8.5 years of their life. They had their dad there for 1.5 years. That's crazy. This war is different than any other war has been before. And they're saying that when those dads come home, and moms, but it's mostly dads, when those dads come home, the PTSD is so great. And the children at my center would say, when Daddy came home and then his eyes were dead? Remember Daddy's eyes were dead? And I go, wow, I think that's a diagnosis for PTSD. Your eyes are dead. Then they're saying that now there's secondary PTSD because it is so unnerving for children when daddy comes home with PTSD that now they're suffering. So the effects of that war are just rippling out everywhere. And they're saying that 2 million children are at risk just from the war, going to need some psychiatric care, but most of them are not going to get it. And then, we go to internet danger. 42% of children ages 7 to 4 admit seeing pornography on the web. 1 in 2 have sent sexual information online. And 1 in 4 have sent sexual pictures of themselves, either online or texting. So I don't need to tell you that the internet is predatory. It's a great gift. I love it. I got my Facebook account. I got my Twitter thing going. I got all that going. But it is predatory on children, and we need to name that. My friend's son did a report on blowfish. And he typed in blowfish and images, because he needed some images. And what he saw was unbelievable. There was a blowfish, and then there were lots of other people doing lots of things that he did not need to see in the 5th grade. And what they do is they'll misspell a word. If you go and you Google Elsa, which is the most popular little character ever in Disney, what pops up is not the Disney character Elsa. She's there along with lots of other beautiful women inviting you to come to their websites. So they are predatory and they are smart. For the first time in history, do you know that computer, like what we're doing scientifically with computers and stuff, it's not being developed by NASA or by scientists. It is being developed by the porn industry. So all this 3D stuff and all that, that's all the porn industry trying to get this into our homes. So just know that we have to be aware. We have to be very aware of this internet danger. We don't even understand what's happening for children. My own children, I went to hear this thing, and I'm like, we were talking about how when you see this stuff, then you're suspicious of everything, And so I think I'm like all cutting edge and stuff. And I have 2 boys of my own. And when they were high schoolers, I first heard of, what was the thing before Facebook? MySpace. And there was this, guy from the police force, and he said, MySpace is like a place where people are, they're selling drugs to kids, they're doing all this stuff, don't let your kids on MySpace. And I went home to my boys, and I said, boys, come in here. And they sat down, and I said, look, there's this thing, it's called MySpace. I don't want you to get on it. I don't want you to, don't go near it. I just learned about it. It's a horrible place. And they're like, I said, what? They said, oh, we've been on MySpace for 3 years. And I was like, oh, whoa, okay, well, get off it. So, who knew? All right, so anyway, so just know. So depressed enough? Now, you start looking at this. What did I leave off my list? Anybody got something left off my list? Sexual abuse? Not on here, but we know that happens. Sexual harassment, where, somebody's grabbing your bottom at school or saying something tacky to you. What else? You got something happening in your lives that I left off? Parents in jail, prison children, yeah, that's a whole area, growing area. I just read this thing about they're going to start nurseries now in jail because also the people that are in jail are having babies. And so if you think about it, some of the people in jail are children, having children. Anything else?
I teach a class about children living in those domestic violence homes and how it literally changes who they are at all different developmental ages. And I work with teachers and volunteers and people that work with children and learning to identify that and deal with children that are hurting in that way.
Yeah.
And it literally changes their DNA from the time that they're in the womb all the way through their teenage years, how that just being exposed to that violence. Now, half of those children are also being abused themselves, and it's the greatest indicator of when they grow up, whether or not they will either be a victim or be a perpetrator of abuse themselves in relationships.
Wow.
But the good news in all that is that one adult in their life to teach them those lies aren't true is really all it takes to alter that path. So this is fabulous.
Wonderful. Yay, thank you. So next year, you need to do a thing with her. She's an expert here. Yeah, what? Oh, microphone? Oh, you get to be like the microphone woman. I always wanted that job.
I just was going to add to that, and I don't know all the statistics, but I think it's something that we need to look at. At the Holston Conference, annual conference, the speaker there, and her name has gone out of my head if somebody remembers, was really talking statistics about screen time and early screen time with children, and that, that newborn to 3 is when all those synapses are connected. And I'm seeing it more and more and more. People take their babies to movies, their young children to movies. They have the violent movies on television or they're playing the violent video games. And they say that is changing the synapses, just like being exposed to violence in relationships. And that never occurred to me. I mean, I wouldn't have let that be around any children I know, but I didn't realize that watching the video game or watching the violence on the television screen is connecting those synapses in behavior exactly like watching it, is what she proposed. And I don't know the statistics behind that, but that was really enlightening to me, because so many of these parents think, oh, well, they're not seeing it at our house, but they're seeing it on the television. Or, so I just want to add on that.
Or it's looked upon as educational. So parents think they're doing their kid a favor by giving them an iPad because they've been sold this thing that's like, this is going to make your child smarter, and everybody wants the smartest kid, of course. And so, yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I was just going to add, just to follow up on that, part of the issue with that is that while those synapses are developing, the child up through the elementary school ages, their rational brain has not fully developed. So they're going solely on their emotional brain, and they do empathetic learning. And so they literally feel what they're seeing. It's as if it were happening to them, even when it's not. Their empathy is so great at those young ages. And so that changes because they're feeling that as if it's happening to them.
Right. So you can see where that is just, oh my gosh. And, we didn't talk about alcoholism and drug abuse. And talk about hard to get kids to talk about, Like I had kids who's, they came to the center because their mother was an alcoholic. She was getting ready to lose them because she was an alcoholic, whatever. And I would say, so do you ever see your mommy drink? And they'd be like, no. She sleeps a lot. They had like this code language, and they'd be like 5 years old, And then when it would finally come out, they would say, oh yeah, I always knew mommy drank, but I wasn't supposed to talk about it. I mean, secret. So we're getting ready to take a little break, but let me just sort of summarize this first little part. Step 1 in helping hurting children, and that's why we spent so much time on this, is to understand that they are everywhere. This is not a specialized ministry. And the church needs to quit treating it like a specialized ministry. Because what happens is children come to the church with all these hurts, and we send them out to a psychiatrist. They're not going to get there. There's a shortage, and it costs $250 an hour. Or you get 3 visits. So I'm not anti-psychiatry at all. I'm just saying a lot of kids aren't going to get the care they need, and they're never going to get, for the smaller hurts or the ones that aren't, you have to get to a critical mass before anybody will call a specialist. So, and we're in the perfect place to do that. And also want to say, and when we get to our model, that we are the people that understand healing. I know that the medical community has convinced us all that they have the corner on the market, that they're the only people that do healing. But 2,000 years ago, we had Jesus who was healing people with his touch, with his presence, with his forgiveness, with his willingness to accept the fact that they were messed up and a sinner. So we have been healing people for a lot longer than the medical community. Now, it takes a village. I love medicine. Nothing makes me happier than to get like a tooth worked on and get me some of that good Tylenol. I'm into it. However, we as the church cannot say, well, we're going to send that out. And the other thing that has happened is that the church has quit educating people in children. So our seminaries that used to train people who wanted to work with children do not offer programs anymore. So if you want to be a children's pastor, you might find a certificate program, but you can't go now and become a deacon in the thing. So the training has stopped, and churches have also stopped hiring people. When I first started, there were no children's ministers, and then we sort of saw that grow, and a lot of churches had children's ministers, at least churches over a certain size. And so then pastors thought, well, we don't have to worry about children anymore because we've hired somebody to do that. So they kind of quit worrying about children. Well, now we're not hiring people anymore. Maybe we hire someone. Maybe we can afford a part-time salary. I'm not griping about that. I'm just saying times have changed. So I've got all these pastors who say, well, we don't do anything with children. I can't afford it. Okay, well, it's your job. You're the pastor of all the people, including little ones. So, my favorite saying is Dr. Seuss, a person's a person no matter how small. And John Wesley, when we get ordained, we stand up there and we answer questions, and it says, will you take care of the children of your church? And we all said yes. So there's like this weird thing where we started hiring it out. We don't have to worry about it. Now we're not hiring it out, and we're not, supporting the people that are in the position. So now the average children's minister lasts 16 months. So in a child's life, between 0 and 5, they're going to have, 3 different people? And we just got to look at this. So, I don't want to bellyache about this and be like, oh, the good old days when we hired people or the good old days when we did seminary. I'm just saying right now, we got to step up to the plate. And every church needs to be offering children's ministry in some form or fashion, whether that's a volunteer, or I don't care what it is. And when people say we only have 2 kids, we're not going to do children's ministry, that's ridiculous. You have 2 children. They need ministry. We don't wait till we get a critical mass of 500 kids and then start children's ministries. And by the way, what I'm going to talk about is easier to do in a smaller church than it is to do in a large church. Because in a large church, you've got 1 million kids. As much as I loved my children at First United Methodist Church, I think I knew all of their first names. Sometimes I would forget. That's a lot of kids. So what I want to say is, everything we do begins with deciding that we care about kids, seeing them as people who hurt and who have the same pains that we all have, rather than this group of little mini people who are going to grow into people who hurt. We have to see them as the whole little person that they are, and that is step 1, to say, of course they hurt. If you look at anything that is plaguing adults in our society, of course children are affected by that. And I loved your thing about their empathy. They're feeling the stuff that they can't even articulate. And so step 1 is to know that they're there. And step 2 is to care. And to decide that you will enter in relationship with the children. And that's where the church has this great opportunity, because we have relationships with the children. And this is where it goes into Sunday school. However, if you've got this rotating group of people who never see the kids more than once a month or once every other month or once every 3 months, it's going to be really difficult to build those relationships. So, that's a whole nother workshop, right? How do you get people to give up soccer for 3 weeks in a row or whatever? But I'm just saying, relationship is core. So step 1, realize they're hurting. It's not just poor children. It's not the children on just your Wednesday night program. It's not your soup kitchen kids. It's not the kids out there. It's the children out there. It's the children in here. It's every child. And imagine if we could minister to the children that go through their minor hurts, the loss of a dog, the loss of a grandparent, things that we don't typically think of as huge, their first heartbreak, being picked on at school, which we all say, just wipe it off, you'll outgrow it. Imagine if we could do great pastoral care there and teach them that God heals them in these smaller things. Then when they have a big thing, they go, wow, I understand this. I know how to go find God in the midst of this. So those are the first 3 steps. See them as people, realize that they're hurting, and care. Like, be in relationship with them. So having said all that, we're going to take a break, and then when we get back, we're going to get to the nuts and bolts of so what do I do? There's a hurting kid, what do I do? But we've done the hard part. And that's what blows my mind. This is what is blowing my mind. The easy part is this model I'm going to show you. The hard part is to get people to realize that children are hurting. That's the hard part. I don't get it. But of course, I live in a world with hurting kids. So I hope that, I mean, you get it, you're here. So you're like, I know, we knew it, we came to your thing. It's all the other people. But, so anyway, so when you leave here, not only do I want you to help with hurting kids, I want you to be big mouths. I'm going to empower you to speak out and to tell people there are hurting kids everywhere. Everywhere is the word, not there. Everywhere. All right?